Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online event about digital health application. Today, I'm happy to introduce this presentation, which will be given jointly by Medidee, by EIT Health Germany, and by Lauk Venture. So we would have Mailaika Lauk presenting what is the digital application and what is the opportunity associated with that. My colleague Koushik and myself are going to talk about the medical device regulation, what is a medical device software, how do we classify it, and how do we qualify it. And at the end, Michael Lüttgen from EIT Health Germany is going to present the different funding opportunity provided by EIT Health Germany. The presentation, we will mute the microphone during the presentation, but if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chapter. At the end, we will do a Q&A session. If there is a specific question, we will be happy to address them at that time. I hand over the microphone to Mailaika Lauk for the presentation on what is the DIGA.
So from my side, also a warm welcome, hopefully to all in good health. My name is Mailaika Lauk, and I have worked for over 20 years as life science company builder in startups. I'm highly interested in digital technologies in healthcare, and this sector holds an incredibly high potential for applications. The biggest hurdle is the complexity of the healthcare system, and therefore the goal is to bring the different parties together and share information. So let us have an interesting webinar today. My short presentation is about digital health applications. I would like to briefly introduce the new Digital Supply Act in Germany, which forms the legal basis for the reimbursement of digital health applications, abbreviated as DiGA. And I will describe what defines a digital health application in the framework of the German regulation. Okay, I have a problem. Yes, now. Moreover, I will show the steps a digital health application must take in order to be included in the list of reimbursable applications. The basis is a new regulation of the Federal Ministry of Health. The federal government's Digital Supply Act came into force in December 2019. The Healthcare Application Ordinance based on it was published in April 2020 by the Federal Ministry of Health. The Digital Supply Act wants to promote the networking of all parties involved in the healthcare sector with the help of the telematic infrastructure, such as the networking between hospitals, ambulatory care, and pharmacies. Newly included are areas such as physiotherapy, nursing, and midwives. Additionally, the promotion of innovation and research should be introduced by new procedures. For example, it is planned that health insurance funds will be allowed to send data to research centers. The aim is to get new procedures faster into daily standard care. Everything is to be implemented by 2021. Also, the electronic health card is planned for next year. The Digital Supply Act opens a new path for the reimbursed DiGAs by the statutory health insurance funds, where 90% of the German population are part of, which is about 73 million people overall. In most cases, a doctor will write a prescription for a DiGA, but an insurance company can also reimburse the DiGA directly without prescription. The BfArM, Bundesinstitut für Arzneimittel und Medizinprodukte, the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical is the competent authority in Germany for the approval of DiGAs. The BfArM published a guideline describing the requirements of the digger, and all applications that are approved by them will be shown in a directory on an online platform. And the reimbursed applications will be available for download by code. Maybe I think similar as today promotion codes that allowed the download of an app for free. In the guideline of the BfArM, the characteristics of a digger are described as a digger is a medical device of risk class 1 or 2A. It must achieve its medical purpose essentially through its main digital function. This means that it can include also devices, sensors, or other hardware, such as wearables, as long as the main function is digital. The digger is used by the patient or by the service provider and supports the detection, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of diseases. I would like to illustrate these characteristics on the basis of 2 examples from the BfArM's guideline. In this first example, a scale measures data that are displayed by a software. In addition, the user can get information on nutrition and fitness or take a look at integrated training plans for sports. If this system is intended to be used by healthy people, so primarily for wellness and well-being, the application falls into the area of primary prevention. But if the application will be used by patients with high blood pressure, for example, to improve their condition, it serves to treat a disease and is classified as DIGA by the BfArM. Another example taken out of the BfArM's guideline is the reading of data from different diggers, which in itself would represent a platform function only and would not be a digger, as shown on the left side of the slide. But if the application should remind the patient to take his medication, suggest a dosage, and let him confirm the intake, for example, with a smartwatch, then it is a digger because the treatment of a disease is supported. As a side note, reading this example in the BfArM's guideline, I was wondering if this particular app would not be classified in class 3 according to MDR, because a missed dosage of pain medication could lead to serious illness or even death. In the following, I would like to specifically refer to Section 2 and 3 of the DIGA regulation regarding some requirements for the manufacturer. For data protection, the basis is the DGSVO, Datenschutzgrundverordnung, as regulation. Concerning the requirements, there comes a checklist with the BfArM's guideline. The access to the health data is generally only permitted as a result of a two-factor authentication. The German Federal Office for Information Security, BSI, Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik, defines relevant issues in the standards for information security and basic IT protection, IT Grundschutz, concerning management systems for information security, infrastructure, networks, and communication. In any case, you cannot prevent to take a deep dive in this standard to develop your product. The meaning of quality as requirement in this regulation is that the data can be exported in a suitable interoperable format and used in the context of care. Patients should be able to take the data with them when they change their insurance company, for example. Hopefully, the cross-sector care becomes more successful in future. For your digger, you should check if there is an already known medical information object, MAIO, or a standard or profile or guideline recommended in the VESTA directory, because you have to use it if it exists, even if this only applies to part of 80% of your data and content to be exported. An existing profile in the VESTA can also be extended with an interface specification through the Gesellschaft für Telematik-Anwendungen der Gesundheitskarte, Gematik. But not all data must be offered via the standard interface. For example, usage statistics and raw data can be stored in custom formats, of course, always following the data security rules see above. Section 3 of the regulation includes the evidence of positive healthcare effects, user experience, and easy of use and transparency as requirements. Essentially, the manufacturer has to prove that the DIGA is better than the respective treatment without the DIGA, better than other treatments, and also better than other DIGAs if they exist. In order to bring a DIGA quickly into the market, the so-called fast-track process was designed. The manufacturer submits an application to the BfArM to be included in the new directory of reimbursable digital health applications. And he should fulfill the requirements such as safety and functional capability, etc., by CE conformity. And for the submission, the BfArM offers consulting services costing between 250 and 5,000 euro based on their effort. If you have proven positive healthcare effects, either in terms of medical benefit or in terms of process and structural improvement, you will receive the result within 3 months whether your healthcare application is declined or approved. Another possibility is to prove the positive effects on healthcare system or treatment in a preliminary phase within 12 months. In this model, your DIGA will be accepted temporarily for 12 months, and the final decision will be made after this period and after analysis of the respective results. A decision on inclusion to the directory costs from 3,000 to 9,000 euro. If you have a preliminary admission and are accepted after the evaluation phase, another 1,500 to 6,600 euro will be added. If you submit application that treat a rare disease or have a smaller target group for your process and structural improvements, the fee can be reduced by up to a quarter. This should make sure that the barrier for specific application for small patient groups is lower. It is possible to waive the fees at all if the expected economic benefit is particularly low in relation to the costs. The reimbursement of the DIGA is determined according to paragraph 139 of volume 5 of the Social Insurance Code Framework Agreement between the Central Association of the Statutory Health Insurance Companies and the DIGA manufacturers. During a preliminary phase, the manufacturer can initially set a price for this period. Hereby, a maximum amount of the price is defined by the Central Association of the Statutory Health Insurance Companies and manufacturer associations according to the Social Insurance Code. When you are analyzing the price structure of your DIGA, remember that you need to prove that it is more efficient than existing methods, as I mentioned above. So you need to be careful finding the right balance between profit and keeping the bar low in a comparison to other methods. At least I must also be taken into account if there are medical services necessary for the DIGA. In other words, it could happen that the DIGA must be introduced by a physician in an explanatory manner, and perhaps the physician or other professionals need to be integrated with additional services in the continuous use of the DIGA. In this case, the healthcare professional has to be paid separately for his service. Then an adjustment to the Uniform Assessment Standard EBM has to be done, which is the reimbursement system of the statutory health insurance physicians and psychotherapists in Germany. The BfArM wants to establish a directory as a platform for reimbursable DIGAs with an intuitively accessible structure, form, and presentation. On the platform, manufacturers need to provide information for insured persons and patients, as, for example, the endpoint as well the mode of operation. And the content and the use of the DIGA need to be explained in a description that can be understood by a layperson. As manufacturer, you must also provide a summary of your study, its design and results. This means a full application. In your submission procedure of the DIGA, you can mark information where legal requirements conflict with publication in case of intellectual property, but otherwise you must disclose everything. The BfArM recently announced that they already received complete submissions and that they expect the first DIGAs being listed by September. After my deep dive in this matter, I have to admit that I'm rather concerned that this new law will not really to be able to simplify the market access for digital technologies in healthcare. Thank you. You can join me on LinkedIn.
Thank you very much, Mailaika, for this presentation. Very complete. It's interesting to see that medical device regulation shares some of the aspect with the DIGA regulation, and that's what I'm going to go over about now. So in the next little bit less than 1 hour, we are going to look in the detail of the requirement for manufacturers when they have to handle a medical device software. Maybe just before going into this detail, a few words rapidly on Medidee. So my name is Rochat. I'm senior partner at Medidee. And Medidee is a consulting company which is supporting medical device manufacturers in achieving compliance with defined regulation. We are supporting medical device manufacturers in the implementation of the quality management system, so establishing processes to ensure compliance. We're also helping them in addressing regulatory affairs, meaning getting the CE mark or accessing markets like in the US with FDA clearance and so on and so forth. And we are also operating as a clinical research organization. So we support manufacturers in designing and performing clinical studies in order to collect the necessary data. We're also supporting manufacturers with all aspects related to digital health, which is basically complying to the regulation, but it's also addressing specific issues like cybersecurity and data management and privacy. The objective of my presentation today, it's mainly to start by providing you with an overview of the regulatory framework on medical devices in Europe. As we have heard from Mailaika, some of the devices, digital health application will be medical devices. And of course, medical devices are regulated product, and we need to have a look at what is this current regulatory framework. And the second step, we're going to review specific requirements that are related to software within the medical device regulation. Some aspect needs to be taken specifically for this kind of product. And at the end, the third part of the presentation would mainly be to go through a top level presentation of the different requirements which are associated with the development of a medical device. Again, if you do have questions, feel free to push them in the chatter and I'll try to answer them. Looking at medical device, it is important to put them in context. Medical devices are probably the first devices everyone has been in contact with even before being born. And during our whole life, depending on the fortune and infortune, we are going to be confronted to multiple medical devices. And it is, although even possible, that the medical devices will be the last device we will be connected before leaving that world. So what we see is that those medical devices play a very important role in our everyday life. And the reason why we have regulation related to those medical devices, it's basically threefold. The main purpose is first to ensure that the devices are safe. When we are using a medical device, we need to be sure that it's as safe as possible in order to achieve its end use. Then we need to ensure, as a second point, that it's performing as expected. What we need to ensure is that when we're making claims about a medical device, we need to be sure that the device is able to perform as expected. And finally, what we need to ensure is that the device has a clinical benefit. At the end of the day, if we use medical devices, it's because we have a clinical outcome which is expected. The medical device is historically structured in three categories. We have originally what we would call the traditional medical devices that you would find in hospital and around. I mean, that goes from the hip implant to the surgical robot to infusion pump and so on and so forth. So most of the device or large number of devices are considered as medical devices. Then we have subgroup of devices, which is the active implantable medical devices. This is typically devices which will be implanted and which will be powered by energy. So we end up finding typically defibrillator or cochlear implant and all type of neurostimulators. We have a third category, which is in vitro diagnostic devices, which are typically devices which are being used to make evaluation and measure within samples. So this is to make in vitro diagnostic and in vitro assessment. Historically, the software has always been considered as a component of those products. And of course, with the evolution of the technology, we see that we have more and more software which are associated with these medical devices. As mentioned in the first place, historically, there was very often a component or an accessory or part of a system. And more what we see now is that we have software which are standalone and which are by themselves medical devices, and that's typically the case of some of the DIGA. If we look historically on the evolution of the technology, we can see if we look at hospital, which are the main centers for delivering care in our organization, we can see that initially we would have what we call traditional hospital. So those hospitals, maybe 50, 60 years ago, were mainly centers where you would find different specialists. Those specialists, you would meet with them and you would have specific care depending on the condition you would have to address. But the coordination would be limited to interaction. You would not have the use of digital tools. I mean, the patient file would mainly be paper and records will be done manually and stored in different binders. So of course, the communication and the interaction between the different care provider was extremely complicated or not even possible. More recently, we started to have the digital hospital. The digital hospital started basically when we were able to start to generate digital image, digital records, to start to be able to coordinate the different information, to start to capture them in a patient data management system. This has been a long evolution where we started to have more and more devices which were leveraging the different technology which was developed in different fields. Later on, let's say at the beginning of this century to some extent, we start to have the concept of smart hospital. When we look at smart hospital, we can see that if we take the definition of the ENISA, we can see that a smart hospital is an hospital that rely on optimized and automated process built on an ICT environment of interconnected asset, mainly based on Internet of Things, with the idea, of course, to improve the services and the care. So what we see is that more and more the hospital have been connected internally to be able to leverage the different information which is generated. The idea, of course, is to be able to better improve the support of the patient and the care, and to be able to coordinate more and more the different information and the different patient care provider. With the DIGA, we some extent enter a new phase, which is what we could call the connected care. What we see here is that the objective of the DIGA is also to focus on applications which are directly addressing patient needs, being used by patients and in an outpatient context. The idea here is that we are getting out of the hospital and we are connecting the patient directly to the care provider. So we enter a new phases in the way we want to handle these services. What we can see with the COVID situation we all went through during the last months, it has accelerated to some extent this logic. Before the COVID situation, there has always been pioneer on telemedicine, but I mean, we always had to face some resistance on the possibility to handle remotely patients. And with this crisis, we were left with no choice. We had to handle some of the patients remotely, and then telemedicine started to improve. And we can see in different doctor association that we have new guidelines which have been published on how to handle remotely patients. These changes are, of course, being possible thanks to the rapid technological evolution we have seen during the last decades. Now, as I mentioned, having telemedicine or remote medicine is something which is more and more possible. We had this as a first technological outbreak in a few years ago, typically having remote surgery and so on and so forth, which were in the media. Now what we see is that more and more we're able to interact directly with the care provider. What we also see is the increase of the precision medicine. More and more we are able to target specifically patient condition, patient data, patient parameters, in order to be able to design and develop specific treatment for them. Thanks to the mobile health, interestingly, now most of the patients are able to access their health parameters directly online, or they're able to leverage their devices in order to interact with their care provider. Maybe in the future, in the morning when you will start your day, you will be able to open a little app that will give you your health status, like if you were looking at your portfolio on the stock exchange. It's quite interesting to see that now you can have a watch that is basically having an ECG permanently looking over you, or having your blood pressure, which is constantly being measured. Sorry for that. What we also see is that this new capability are providing an increased complexity. We can see now that we have the rapid development of machine learning algorithms, which are supporting a lot of medical device application. We have an increased use of the cloud, where data can be stored, but where we can also process at high scale data. And of course, we have a greater complexity with the interconnectivity. What we see now typically is that when you have an app on your phone, very often this app is communicating with a backend somewhere or with multiple backends. This situation is also bringing new constraints. What we see is that we have a rapid evolution of products. Medical devices, to some extent, tend to be at the same pace as consumer product. You expect to have rapid evolution in different products. This is an expectation. We have new channel of distribution. Typically with the Google stores, app stores, you start to find medical devices in different places where you have found it in the past. And of course, you have patients which are getting more and more autonomous, and where they have higher expectation in terms of their medical care. They also get more and more informed, so you need to provide different type of information in order to fulfill the expectation. This situation leads to new challenge in the software evolution that needs to be well anticipated. As I mentioned, we have medical devices tends to be considered for some extent as consumer product, where you would expect to have multiple release per year. So the question is, how do you manage those multiple release per year? With a medical device, it's very complex to handle multiple release per year, because you need to go through an approval process which is not designed to be as fast as making multiple release. You also need to define the reporting line. I mean, when you have a problem with your software or when you have a problem with a medical device, in some occasion, you have to make notification to the competent authority. You need to withdraw the device from the market. How are we going to do this with application? Distribution of the software. If you go on a web platform, then you will have the possibility to distribute your software in multiple ways, but you also have other companies who are controlling those app stores. So you need to understand what they do with your software in order to be sure that it's still available in the way you expect. Of course, security aspects are something fundamental and even more and more important. Cybersecurity threat to data, to the proper operation of the device are a concern. And you also need to be sure that your device is able to integrate with IT, hospitals, and the different network. What is the benefit of your device? If it collects data, it's connected, but you're not able to exchange this data with other systems. What we see as well as a great challenge is everything related to validation aspect. Typically, how do I validate my machine learning algorithm? It's something that we are evolving rapidly on this, but we don't necessarily have all the key for all the application. And then the question is also, where is my medical device when I have a system? Typically, if I have an app, I have a web front end, I have backends. I mean, where does start my medical device and where does it stops? These challenges are progressively transforming the regulatory approach, but one needs to keep in mind that the evolution of the regulation, as we will see after, is quite slow. Some new challenges here are not even yet really addressed in the regulation. So there will be a difference between, let's say, the state of the art, what is expected and what is being done and what is possible actually from a technological standpoint, and what the regulation is able to address, let's say, in a fast and efficient way. The regulatory context might seem quite crowded. I mean, when you want to start with your medical device, you are directly confronted to the regulation. And as you can see, multiple regulation may apply to your device, and you need to be able to identify the routes. What we observe from the market is that from time to time, when you're confronted to the, the medical device challenge, you realize that the path might not be so simple. So the challenge with a medical device at the end of the day, when you want to place it on the market, is maybe not to identify what are the regulations that apply, because you will find them at the end, everything is more or less public. What might be difficult is to be able to follow the right pathway in order to be as fast and as efficient as possible. And here I can only urge you to basically, when you start with your project, to have a very clear plan on how you're going to tackle and how you're going to address the different regulatory aspects in order to avoid repeating some activities and missing some of mandatory things you should have done. Let's have a look at this European legislation and this framework. The European framework is quite interesting for manufacturers because it provides a single market which comprises 28 member states, at least today. Maybe at the end of the year, we will be a little bit less because obviously UK has decided to leave us, and Switzerland might also follow the same pace to some extent. We'll see how it will evolve in the coming year. But nonetheless, what is interesting is that when you're working and when you're developing a medical device, whether in Germany, whether in France, whether in Denmark, you actually have a direct access to 28 member states. And it's even more interesting with online application, with software, because you don't have the issue for the distribution of these softwares. The principle of the European framework is that there is a free movement of goods. The idea is that normally when you are able to place a product in one country, according to the European legislation, this product can move in the different countries. So as I just mentioned, it opens a large number of opportunities, because if you're targeting, let's say, the German market as a start, you can very rapidly move to other countries, providing other opportunities. Nonetheless, you have to take in mind and to keep in mind that other countries may have some differences that you have to address, typically languages. Of course, if you design your application for the German market, you would design it with the German language. But if you decide to place it on the Danish or on the Italian market, obviously you will have to address those aspects as well. To be able to implement this concept of free movement, there is basically three conditions that needs to be met. And those three conditions are mainly to ensure that essential requirements with the product are defined and they are met. So that's what we will see just after. It also needs to define the method and to establish how the product compliance is demonstrated, is assessed and demonstrated. And then we need to define mechanism to supervise and control the action of the different stakeholders involved in the use of this product. And this is basically what is the European legislation about. It addressed those 3 points in order to define a common framework within the different European countries. And this concept is basically formalized in the CE mark. So the CE mark is interestingly a European concept. That's what it says, a CE mark. It basically says that the product is conforming with the applicable legislation for the given product. CE mark is not only limited for medical devices. I mean, you have CE mark in multiple type of devices. If you take the toys of your kids, you will see that there is a CE mark. If you take your iPhone or your Android phone and you look at it, you will see there is CE mark. Same as your computer. If you go in an elevator, you want to check that it's CE mark, so that should be a good sign for your safety, and so on and so forth. So there is multiple directives in Europe, and those directives are actually being used to regulate and define the expectation towards a given product. So at the end of the day, what will be needed with your product, with your software, when it is considered as a medical device, you will have to be able to affix the CE mark on your product. In order to do that, you will have to be able to fulfill what we call the general safety and performance requirements, and we will look into this a little bit more later. So what is important to keep in mind is that the CE mark is something which is mandatory. If you don't have the CE mark, you're not able to place your medical device on the market. So if you don't have the CE mark, then you don't have business. Interestingly, with the DIGA, what we can see is actually the CE mark is a condition to get the reimbursement. So we could actually make a different statement, which is with CE mark, you have access to additional business. When we look at the different players that are having a role in this market with the medical device manufacturers, we first have the manufacturers. So the manufacturers in our situation is the company who is actually placing the software on the market. Usually that's a software editor, but it's the legal entity that is taking the responsibility to place the device on the market. At the end of the day, the manufacturers basically hold the responsibility. He's the one to ensure that the device is complying with law. He's the one who is responsible to ensure and to monitor that the device constantly remains safe and being used as expected. We have another stakeholder which is really important in the medical device horizon, which is the notified body. The notified body is an independent body which is accredited by the member state that we have in the country. And this notified body's role is to perform what we call the conformity assessment. So the idea is that this independent body is going to review the work you have done in terms of demonstrating safety and performance of your device, and is going to verify that you actually conform and fulfill the different legal requirements. When those legal requirements are being fulfilled, then you will have a CE certificate and you will be able to affix the CE on your medical device. The last entity is the competent authority, BfArM for Germany, but the competent authority for the medical devices has the responsibility to monitor the market. So the competent authority, to the contrary of DIGA, so with DIGA, the competent authority BfArM is taking a position, so it's reviewing the file and taking decision on whether the device can be considered or not as a DIGA and enter the registry. With the medical device regulation, the competent authority is only monitoring the market. What it means, it is checking that the devices which are being placed on the market have been correctly go through a conformity assessment process, that they bear effectively the CE mark, and that they are conforming with the different requirements. So this is, let's say, to some extent, the police that is checking that the different actors, mainly the manufacturers and the notified bodies, are doing their job correctly. Historically, for those who are not really from the medical device area, we are in the middle of a change, which is quite significant because we are moving from two regulatory contexts. Historically, we were having directives, which were law documents published by the European Council, which was defining the context and the legislative framework. And we would have one directive for the active implantable devices, as we have seen before. We would have one directive, 9342, for the medical devices, and we would have one more for the in vitro diagnostic devices. And we would have three directives to be more precise. Interestingly, the first numbers is actually the year where the directive has been published. So you can see that the medical device legal framework was basically from the 90s. So we cannot really say that the framework was extremely modern, although it has been updated from time to time during the last year. What happened in 2017 is that we had a change in the regulation. So the European Commission decided, or the European Parliament actually decided, to replace the directive and to come with a regulation. And they regrouped the active implantable and the medical devices in one regulation and generated another regulation for the IVD. We are in a change because this regulation have been voted by the Parliament in 2017, and they were supposed to enter into application in this year, basically last month, on May 26th. But due to the COVID situation, the enter into application has been postponed of 1 year. So now we're still in the transition period where we already have the requirement of the new regulation, whereas the previous requirements of the previous framework are still possible to use. So if you want to get a CE mark today on your medical device, you definitely need to have a look at the medical device regulation, because that's what will happen tomorrow. Whereas if you already have your device ready, you can already fulfill the requirement of the existing directive and place your device on the market. It is important to see that this new regulation had multiple objectives. And I think it's important to keep in mind what are the objectives, because it also explains the level of expectation and how much we have to comply with the regulation. Not in the sense that we have a chance not to comply with the regulation, but how much data and how much information we have to generate and provide to be able to comply with the regulation. So the first point was mainly to have only one single text that would be able to apply to all member states. The particularity of the medical device industry was that depending on the country, since we had directives, you would find different expectations from different countries. Historically, countries would actually make some different requirements, so you would not have a perfectly similar situation between the different countries. The goal as well was to eliminate some gray zone, and here I'm afraid that the regulator has not really succeeded, because maybe they have fixed some of the gray zone, but obviously new gray zone are being introduced, and this is to some extent quite to be expected with new regulation. There was an expectation to catch up with technological innovation, and this is typically the inclusion of software within the regulation. Nonetheless, what we can see is that legal processes are always behind technological innovation. I mean, some of the concepts we find now on the technology field are not regulated by the market, or we don't necessarily know exactly how to regulate them. The idea was also to enhance control of a notified body, so basically increase the expectation toward notified body to ensure that their job, the job they're doing as controlling and assessing the conformity, was done in a complete and efficient manner. Of course, ensuring the competence of the different players, and also improve the transparency and information exchange between the stakeholder. I'm not exactly sure that this objective has been achieved so far, but let's hope that in the future more and more information will be able to circulate and the transparency of the market will evolve. The objective at the end, and it's really important to keep that in mind, is that the change was really to promote the safety for the patient. I mean, this whole change in the regulation, although it was cooking for some time at the European Parliament, was triggered by the PIP scandal. So some of you may recall that a few years ago, we had this scandal with breast implant, which was quite a disaster in the way that was handled, and that was quite an unacceptable situation. And based on this case, the European Parliament decided that it was time to restructure the way we would organize and regulate the market. And that's where they come with this new regulation. So at the end, this new regulation has an objective to significantly increase the safety of the user, meaning that you as manufacturers, as software editor, you have the challenge to demonstrate that your device is indeed safe and performing as expected. If we look at the regulation, I invite you to all read this regulation. This is a particularly interesting document, especially during long evening of the winters. But what you will see in that regulation is that you have a common structure. So you have the general principles that are defined in the recital. So it's always useful to have a look to understand what are the principles that govern such regulation. Then we have the article, which are going to define what is the expectation of the law itself. So this typically where you'll find definition, you'll find a requirement, and so on and so forth. And then you have the annexes. And as very often in legal documents, the annexes are maybe the most interesting document. Among those annexes, you have some of them that you should read in priority. And the first one is, of course, the Annex 1, which is the general safety and performance requirement. This annex is basically telling you everything your device shall comply with before putting it on the market. So if you design a software and your software is a medical device, you will be able to affix the CE mark only when you have fulfilled all the requirements which are defined in this Annex 1. If we look at the other annexes, we see that there is expectation for the technical documentation. So you'll have expectation on how you structure the information and how you provide it. Classification rules are also defined in one of the Annex 8. So the classification is the type of devices. My colleague Koushik is going to present that in more detail just after. But basically, depending on the nature of the device, you may have different requirement and element to assemble. And then you have additional requirement typically on the clinical evaluation, something which is very useful because this process basically defines how you demonstrate the clinical benefit of your device and what you have to achieve to do that. But let's say as a minimum, if you want to start to read something, you should read this Annex 1, which is giving you basically the entry cost for placing your device on the market. Just to see again the evolution, because the message I'm trying to pass here is that there is an expectation from the regulator that manufacturers of medical devices come with more and more evidence that their device is performing as expected. And what we can see here as an example is that we have a change between the medical device directive, which was the previous legal framework, and the new medical device regulation, the new regulation. And what we can see here basically is that in the past, we had no classification for the software. Basically, software was simply considered as active devices. So we are not really looking at software. There was basically one essential requirement, which was mainly mentioning that the software shall be developed according to the state of the art. And we also had only one harmonized standard, so one technical standard, which was recognized by the European Commission as a mean to demonstrate compliance, and that was the IC 62304. Whereas in the new regulation, what we see is that now we have a specific classification rule for software. So we really look at the software themselves, and we have to take position on how we classify the software. Specific definition have been integrated in the regulation, typically compatibility, interoperability. So, I mean, we start to really integrate the dynamic of the software within the regulation. we have specific requirements in those general safety performance requirements we're going to look right after. And of course, we have now also to fulfill the, as for other medical devices, all the other requirements typically for technical documentation and for clinical evaluation. If we look in more detail what the regulation has brought in terms of specific requirement, we see we have typically one where we have to reduce the risk as far as possible. So the risk associated with the software, the possible negative interaction between software and the IT environment within which it operates and interacts. So here what we see is that the regulator is expecting close design control, is expecting that the risk associated of the use of the device within a given IT environment is correctly controlled. So basically when you use your device, it should not negatively affect the context. Of course, medical devices have also been used in cyber in hack basically, and the cyber security is also underlined in these clauses. The next one, typically, we see that in the event of a single fault condition, appropriate means shall be adopted to eliminate or reduce as far as possible consequent risk of impairment of performance. The notion of risk management is the cornerstone of the medical devices. I mean, you always need to develop and maintain a risk analysis with regard of your device, how it performs, how it affects the user, and so on and so forth. And here we see that the regulator is going one step further with the device because it specifically addressed the issue of single fault. We also see that for devices that incorporate software, for software that are devices in themselves, they shall be developed and manufactured in accordance with the state of the art. This notion of state of the art is really important, taking into account the principle of development lifecycle, risk management, including information security, verification, and validation. So basically here the regulator is saying, okay, when you're designing your software, you need to ensure that the way you're designing it, the way you're handling the risk, the way you are making verification and validation shall be according to the state of the art, meaning that you need to keep up to date on what are the change in method, in practice with regard to typically information security, with software development, and ensure that you remain state of the art. This also opens all the door, of course, for obsolescence. I mean, how do you maintain your software? Typically, if it's using a framework which is obsolete and which is not correctly maintained. So the notion of update, the notion of how you ensure that your system is continuously performing in a rapidly evolving environment is something that you have to keep in mind and to take into consideration. We see then that the software that is intended to be used in combination with mobile computing platform shall be designed and manufactured taking into account the specific features of the mobile platform and external factor. So it's really interesting here because when you're designing an app or you're designing a software, you need to take into consideration the different platform on which your software is going to be developed. So of course, if you develop an app that is going to run an iOS environment, and then the same app is going to run an Android environment and maybe other type of environment, you need to be sure that the particularity of this environment are correctly addressed. Same with the hardware. I mean, if you have your software running on different type of devices, you need to be sure that the particularity of the hardware is being addressed. But in the meantime, you also need to take into consideration the user. I mean, you may have different user for the different device that you're planning to use. So you need to be sure that these aspects have been taken into account. So from that perspective, usability is something that counts. We see further in the next requirement that we need to set out minimum requirement concerning hardware, IT network characteristic, IT security measure, including protection against unauthorized access necessary to run the software as intended. What we see here is that there is a clear expectation that the design of the application is perfectly controlled, but also that security aspects are taken into consideration, in particular to prevent unauthorized access. So this is the open door for the aspect related to the control of the security from a cyber perspective. So what can we take home as a message when we look at the regulation for the software? The first point is that with this MDR, the regulator in general wanted to increase the control on medical device in general. So this regulation is actually designed to be sure and to increase the safety of the user. What we can see also is that now the regulator is willing specifically to address software. I mean, we're not considering the software just as an active device. We have specific risks that need to be addressed. We also have additional requirements that have to be applied on top of the general requirement. We have specific requirements that will introduce specific controls from authorities and notified bodies. So you can expect that probably BfArMs and others are going to control that your device is indeed ensuring cybersecurity aspect, because this is specific requirement, and when you have requirement, they need to be controlled. And what we can see also in this regulation is that the regulator wanted to correct a gap within cybersecurity. That was something which was quite an issue on the market with medical devices in the past. What we see now is that the regulator has taken a step forward in order to address this challenge in the future. What is also interesting is that the MDR covers quite some of the expectation from the DVG requirement when you have a DIGA. I mean, the MDR is talking about safety, about performance, about data protection, and about clinical benefit. So what we can see is that if you address when you address the regulation for medical devices, you have a framework that enable you to prepare the necessary documentation that you will provide to BfArM in order to demonstrate that your device is fulfilling the requirement of the law. So to some extent, this regulation is maybe a constraint, but it's certainly also an opportunity. Let's move a little bit forward for the last 10 to 12 minutes with the requirement for the medical device software. So as I mentioned, the key aspect is that you have to comply with the GSPR, so the General Safety and Performance Requirements. So you have to demonstrate that your software is addressing all the requirements of the law. To make it simple, you basically have to take into consideration 4 dimensions. You need to implement a quality management system, so you need to implement different processes which are structured and organized. You need to prepare a technical documentation, and this technical documentation will actually be used to demonstrate compliance with the requirement, with a different requirement. You need to make a clinical evaluation, so you need to collect the different clinical data that is available to you. You need to assess them, and you need to use them to demonstrate that at the end of the day, using your device is generating a benefit for the patient, which is greater than the risk which are associated. And finally, you need to go through the conformity assessment process because at the end, you need to be able to affix a CE mark on your device. Looking in more detail at this, so the quality management system is it's what you will implement at your organization level. So this quality management system is the formalization of the different documents and processes that you use. And basically what you are doing through your quality management system is that you're defining the processes that you implement, the controls that you implement, and the different activities that you do while designing your device. The quality management system is not only focused on design, but it's focused on all the activity that may affect directly or indirectly the product. So basically it concerns more or less the whole organization. Usually this is done through a quality, the management system is done through a quality manual. You will have work instruction, you will have standard operating procedure, and of course the most important, you will have to document the different evidence that you have in terms of compliance, typically test protocols and so on and so forth. You have 2 standards here that you definitely want to consider. The ISO 13485 is basically giving you the basic requirement for quality management systems. So it tells you what you have to address and what you have to implement in order to address those requirements. And you have the 14971, which is describing the risk management process with medical devices. And basically, you need to ensure that when you handle risk management, you actually consider the requirement of this process. The next step is the technical documentation. So the technical documentation is what you assemble It's all the information related to your device that will demonstrate compliance, whether from a design perspective, a manufacturing perspective, a clinical perspective, and so on and so forth. So you can depict that historically as a big binder where you would find all the information related to your device. Of course, today we don't really expect to have a paper format anymore, but you need to be able to compile all the documentation that demonstrate how your device has been manufactured and tested. Software standard that you want to consider. So the 62304 is a standard that is going to define to some extent a state of the art. This can be debated, but this is basically defining the different step for the software lifecycle management, from the assembly of the requirement all the way down to the verification and validation, and well, to the verification and the release of the software. Again, the 14971 is going to be useful to address the risk aspect, which are also covered in the 62304. And another standard which is useful to take into consideration is the 82304, which basically complete the 62304 by expanding the scope of the design process. So when you want to implement a design process and let's say life cycle management process that is compliant with the regulation, you want to have a look at these different standards. You then have the clinical evaluation, which is a fundamental point within the compliance demonstration, because the clinical evaluation is what you're going to do to demonstrate that your device is actually bringing a clinical benefit to the patient. So at the end, this clinical evaluation, which is not the clinical investigation, the clinical evaluation is basically the process of assembling all the clinical data that you have that may come from the literature, that may come from clinical investigation, that may come from the market through post-market surveillance. You're going to assemble this different data, and you're going to make an appraisal of it, and you're going to identify the information that you can use to justify that your device is first safe and that the device is actually performing as expected. You have to keep in mind that with software, very often we might do performance-based evaluation, where we are able to leverage verification and validation data to demonstrate that the device is performing as expected. But at the end, what is the goal of this process is to be able to demonstrate that the benefit outweigh the risk. So what you want to demonstrate is that this device has a benefit to be used. Interestingly, when you look at the law, the DVG law, you can see that BfArM is also looking at this aspect. Is this software actually providing a benefit, and how this benefit is to be compared with other existing treatments? So at the end of the day, you want to compare yourself with your treatment and other treatment to show if your treatment is performing better or not compared to the other. Of course, it might be a challenging way to do that, but the European Commission proposed two ways of addressing this, which are complementary to each other. So we have a European guidance, which is called the Medidee. You can type that in Google. It's a free document that is accessible. And this guidance is basically defining you the requirement on how to define and to implement the clinical evaluation. You have also the MDCG guidance. So the MDCG are new guidances which are defined by the European Commission, which help the manufacturers to address the requirement of the regulation. And here we have a specific guidance on the clinical evaluation for medical device software. So of course, it's kind of mandatory that you have a look of this document when you're doing a medical device conformity assessment process, but you also want to have a look at this document when you prepare for submission with a DIGA, because it's likely that this method will be recognized as a state of the art to justify the clinical usefulness of your software. We then have the fourth aspect, which was the conformity assessment. So the conformity assessment, as mentioned a little bit earlier, is performed by a notified body. So notified body, you have multiple of them available. You have multiple in Germany with TÜV Süd, with TÜV Rheinland. You have in Netherlands with DEKRA. You have in Belgium with SGS. In Netherlands with BSI as well. In Norway with DNV. So you have multiple notified body which are able to help you with the certification of your product. Nonetheless, you of course want to be sure that the notified bodies has the necessary competence to make the review of your system. This conformity assessment process will be made on the basis of first the technical documentation you have assembled, but it will also be made through an audit of your quality management system. So you'll actually have auditor coming and audit your system to ensure that the processes that you have implemented are complying with the regulation. And at the end, the clinical evaluation is going to be reviewed. So interestingly, when you get the CE mark on your device, the underlying principle is that you have been able to demonstrate to the notified body that your device was providing a beneficial clinical outcome. So this is a valuable information in the subsequent process, typically for DIGA. What you want to consider is that you want to schedule your conformity assessment process early because it takes time. The change in regulation has actually affected severely the notified body. We had in the past 53 notified body serving manufacturers in Europe. I think now we have only 16 or something like this. The number has significantly been reduced because all notified body had to get reaccredited. The same notified body have to address devices which are already on the market, and they now have also to address new devices which are placed on the market. So we have here a huge bottleneck effect, where if you want to start an interaction with a notified body, you may have the bad surprise that the notified body is telling you, sorry, we don't take new customer now. So if you plan to have a medical device on the market, and if you need a notified body, I clearly invite you to start with this task. Of course, when you do the conformity assessment process, you need to have a documentation which is ready and complete. Don't expect the notified body to tell you what is missing. You will end up with basically non-conformities and observation. It's your job to ensure that the documentation is complete and is auditable and is addressing the different requirements. And at the end, even if DIGA is only with class 1 and class 2A, what we see is that the conformity assessment process is mandatory with class 2A, 2B, and class 3 medical devices. And as you will see in the next presentation, the question of classification is quite important. And we don't believe that there will be that many software with class 1 at the end of the day due to the change in regulation. So basically, you'll have most of the software will be at least medical device class 2A. One more thing, cybersecurity, I mentioned it. This is really a major issue now within the healthcare industry, and a lot of people are working to try to fix a different issue with cybersecurity. So have cybersecurity of your app as one of the key requirements, because this will be controlled and this will be investigated. When you need to ensure that the device that you're placing on the market is actually a software which is safe, not only from a patient perspective, but also from a security perspective. Both are clearly linked, and you need to be sure that your device is being secure. Here you have good help. The European Commission has prepared a guidance on what to address in cybersecurity for medical device, and you certainly want to read that guidance when you start your project. But you also have other technical standards which are really useful, like the 62443, that give you a whole family of requirements related to IoT, we can say. And you also have an American standard, which is the AMI Tier 57, which is giving you a lot of input for risk management with regards to your software. So, as a conclusion, what's next? Well, first of all, you have to define precisely what your software does. This is what we see in most cases with project, is that when we start with a project, the claim of a software or the claim of a medical device is not clear. What does your product do? What do you want to make as a claim? I mean, it's not possible to address everything. You need to have priority and you need to be really specific. And it's really important because you will have to demonstrate with clinical data that your software is effectively doing what you claim. So having claims is the first start that is really going to help you all the way along. Then you want to verify if you have a medical device. The next presentation will help you to do this. If you have a medical device, obviously you have to follow the regulation. If you don't have a medical device, then you're not subject to the regulation. So maybe you don't want to be regulated. So you have to look at this aspect. Then you want to implement the software development environment and processes that enable you to meet regulatory expectation. You cannot expect to be compliant at the end of your project just by preparing some documentation. This is really part of a process. So you need to be sure that the way you design your software, the way you test it, the way you place it on the market, the way you follow up with this device is actually compliant, and this is the best way to ensure that you will meet the regulatory expectation. You need to implement a quality management system to structure and organize your processes, and you need to develop your clinical evaluation strategy. Very early, take into consideration what data you have, what is available in the literature, and what data do you need. Software are usually connected device, meaning that you have the ability to acquire data. So this can be something very useful if you plan this very early in the process. So when you start your project, already think about the clinical approach and how you're going to justify the usefulness, the clinical usefulness of your product. Then you will compile the necessary documentation within the technical file, and you will go through a conformity assessment process with a notified body. This should lead you to a CE mark, and then you will be allowed to place your device on the market. That was the last slide I wanted to present you. I thank you for your attention, and I will hand over the microphone to my colleague.
Hi, I had a couple of questions for Kim. It's in the chat box. Is it the right time to address those?
Yes, I will look at the question during the next presentation. I'll get back to you just after, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Heiko. And very good morning, everyone. And before I begin, I would like to thank Kim for the wonderful training, or for the wonderful presentation, and for making us introduced on the landscape of the medical devices and how they're regulated within the European Union. So before I begin with the presentation, a very brief introduction about myself. My name is Somashekara Koushik Ayalasomayajula, and I'm also working with Medidee since the last 2 years, and I'm actively involved in the implementation of quality management systems and making the necessary market approvals and the market approaches for the medical devices, which are classified as or which are into the categorizations of the medical devices, and also with the other regulatory markets, as in the US, UK, and the other world markets, and so on. So speaking about from today, so what we're gonna principally have an idea is, so the main objectives for today's presentation is, so we will be focusing on understanding, on how the classification criteria for the medical device softwares are defined, within the scope of the new medical device regulations. And then, generically, we'll be having a short overview on how the medical devices are classified. And then typically we'll be looking into the classification rules that are explicitly talking about the classification of software that falls under the regulation. So in order to understand on when we need to classify the devices and when we need to go on and make a further strategy on for the classification, so it is important for us to have an idea on when or where actually to start. So for the very first question is, what exactly is a medical device? So let's begin from the definition of the medical devices, and then we can continue forward to understand on how they can be actually classified. So if we look into the Article 2 of or the definition 1 of Article 2 of the new medical device regulation, a medical device is classified, or it is defined as any instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, or material which is intended by the manufacturer to be used alone or in combination for human beings. So at least it is important for the classification of a particular product to be a medical device within the European Union. It is important that we understand that the device or the product is intended for human beings to achieve either one or the following, one or more of the following medical purposes. So if you have a product intended for the usage in the human beings, talking about, with the purpose of having a diagnosis or a prevention or monitoring or prediction or alleviation of a disease, or to compensation of an injury, or in order to have an investigation or replacement of a physiological or a pathological process of state, or by means of an in vitro examination from the human body, and so forth. So this is not just only the requirement, having a precise purpose on where exactly your particular device is addressing is one of the major classification requests. And then, of course, we also have the intended actions, the primary mode of actions, so which is also supposed to be taken into consideration for a particular product to be classified as a medical device. And the second one being, if we do have, after defining the purpose, after defining that the product is addressing to the human beings and also talking about addressing of a specific medical purposes, and if we are now in a position to establish or to justify that the principal intended action, so the principal intended action is not achieved by the pharmacological or immunological or metabolic means in or on the human body, but it can be assisted. So that means, it is important that the device or the product which has been developed or which has been intended for the usage on the human beings to address a particular medical condition or to address the medical functions is primarily, or is not, the principal mode of action is not intended by the pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. Rather, these actions can be a part of its the secondary mode of actions, but the principal action is still going to be the mechanical way. And one of the difference when compared to the medical device directives, which are currently active, and the upcoming medical device regulation, which will be replacing the existing directives, is the inclusion of the products, the devices for the control or support of conception, and also products specifically intended for cleaning, disinfection, or sterilization of the devices. So the definition of a medical device is now a bit more expanded, or is a bit more generalized. And now, we also need to take into account the devices which are used for control or support of conceptions, and also the products that are specifically intended for cleaning and the disinfection or the sterilization of the devices can also be now deemed as in the medical devices. So as Kim was showing us a picture yesterday, in the previous presentation, so the very first devices, there can be a lot of devices that we can actually interface with in the course of the life cycle or in the course of the lifetime, which may be granted as a medical device. And software is now one of a biggest upcoming developments within the industry of the healthcare sectors, where the significant usage or the significant increase of the software is actually projected. And now, in order to understand, how the software is classified under the MDR, so as I was just mentioning, so for any particular device or any particular product to be classified as a medical device, it is important to identify that the product fits into the definition of a medical device. That means it must be targeted for the use of humans, and it needs to have a medical purpose. So the very first step when you want to understand, when you want to classify your software according to the MDR, is you need to be in a position to evaluate, is particular software falling in scope, or is it actually excluded from the scope of the new medical device regulation. So for such sort of a thing to happen, it is often important to define on the intended purpose. So the intended purpose is the way, the means of use. So the intended purpose is defined as the way for which the device is intended according to the data supplied by the legal manufacturer. So if a legal manufacturer is claiming that the device can be used for a particular medical purpose, so this will become the intended purpose of that particular product. And based on the intended purpose, the classification of a product is done. And so if the intended purpose is fitting into the definitions of a medical device, then the product will be further classified down as a medical device and will be possibly taken down or dealt with the regulations or with the requirements which are explicitly mentioned within the medical device regulations or the corresponding regulations. So the very first step is try to identify what exactly is the intended purpose of the device, of the product in question, and then it is important to go on and qualify if the intended purpose of the product in question is qualifying to be a software or to be a medical device as per the definitions of the new medical device regulations, and then identify or assess if the devices are actually falling in scope of the regulation or if they're out of scope of the regulation. So as I said, in order to understand, what exactly is the intended purpose, so it's equally essentially going back again to the same definition. So as we discussed in the couple of previous slides, that the definition of the medical devices also includes software. A medical device can also be a software for the use on the human beings. And if we are able to prove that, okay, so the medical device, I mean, the software, what is now under question is used in the diagnosis or the prevention or the monitoring or in the treatment or alleviation of a disease, or if the diagnosis, I mean, if the software can be used for diagnosis, monitoring, or compensation for an injury or a disability, or to assess a replacement or modification of a physiological or a pathological process or state. So, or the control or the support of conceptions and so on. So the primemost function, where exactly, I mean, which particular medical function is actually being addressed by the software is supposed to be determined by the legal manufacturer of the software, I mean, who is intending to bring a particular product on the market. And this particular definition of the intended purpose is going to be playing a huge role in the further classification on deciding if a software will be regulated according to the requirements of the MDR, or will it not be a medical device and can be controlled without having such stringent regulations. Also, the regulation also points out that a medical device or a software which is intended for lifestyle and for well-being purposes is not a medical device. So if you have a software which is not intended to address any of the medical conditions, but if it is only talking, or if it is only gathering some data in order to understand, or in order to gather some data to predict something from the lifestyle perspectives, or it is only the informative purposes for the tracking of the well-being, and this sort of a software will not be classified as a medical device by themselves. But if the intended usage or the intended purpose of the medical device is actually tweaked up or it is modified, then there is always a possibility that the particular version of a medical device can actually fall under the radar of the medical device regulations, and the requirements of the new MDR needs to be applied and should be complied with. So in order to understand on how to classify or how to assess or to have to reach to a conclusion to classify a software as a medical device, there is a guidance from MDCG, Medical Device Coordination Group, which is now providing, I mean, on qualification, I mean, or what are the different steps, or what are the different decisions or the decision steps that needs to be taken in order to qualify and classify the software in the regulation. So the MDCG guidance basically asks you, I mean, it makes you to walk through a flow chart, I mean, which will enable you to separate, I mean, which will enable you to answer a couple of questions talking about your particular product. So asking from, I mean, which are basically ranging from, I mean, is your product really fitting for the definition of a software? I mean, a software can be any data or any computer program which takes an input and which provides an output. And then also, does the software performs any sort of an action on the data different from storage, archival, communication, or simple search? So if you say that the software is not performing any data other than, I mean, is not performing any function other than the simple storage of the data, or the simple storage, or the simple archiving, or a communication, that means transmission of a medical or a non-medical information from point A to point B, or if it is only talking about a simple search kind of a thing. I mean, if you're considering yourself in a hospital management system, and if you want to retrieve a patient record, and if you just want to search with the patient name or with the patient unique ID that the hospital normally assigns, so all such sort of a softwares, I mean, where there is no additional action is actually being performed by the software, but it is rather intended to only store or archive the communication, or just only to perform a simple search. So are they actually classified as a medical device or not? And then at the end again, I mean, as I mean, it is important for any medical device to provide a benefit for the individual patient. Is there any clinical benefit coming up from your particular software that is addressed within the intended purpose of your software that is actually being done by the legal manufacturer? So in order to understand, I mean, in order to define, in order to check if the software is regulated within the scope of the medical device regulations, so following the pathway as depicted in the MDCG guidances will be a very helpful tool to understand if any of your steps, or if any of your products will be regulated by this. As I was mentioning in my previous slide, I mean, the MDCG guidance points out a flow chart where you are, I mean, where the legal manufacturers are allowed to go and walk through 5 different questions to check if the products that they are currently developing are fitting into the definition, or are they fulfilling the criteria of the terms and the terminologies as defined within the guidance document, and also taking into consideration the further applicable requirements of the regulation. So if you're directly talking about, I mean, if a software is not falling into the definition of the guidance, then I mean, of course, I mean, the software is not directly covered by this guidance, and this can be excluded. And then if we say that, okay, I mean, if the software is used within as an accessory for a medical device, or is a software directly influencing the usage of a direct medical device, then of course, I mean, you need to consider, and this, I mean, the reason for inclusion of the softwares which are driving or influencing the usage of the medical devices, I mean, we'll be looking into detail during the classification sessions in the next couple of slides. And then in the same way, I mean, is the software performing any action on the data different from storage, archival, communication, or simple search? So as we just said, I mean, if it is only speaking about, I mean, if the functionality of the software is only to address, only to perform the storage or archival or communication, then this sort of softwares will not be directly taken down, or they are not covered by the medical device regulations. And or if the software performs some other functions, or not only talking about the simple search functionalities, but I mean, at the end of the day, if there is no clinical benefit for the individual patient as well, I mean, then the softwares which are having no clinical benefit, I mean, can be ruled out. I mean, they are not covered, or they can be excluded from the scope of the medical device regulations, which is the MDR. And then again, I mean, if your software is talking about having about an individual, a benefit for the individual patient, and if the software is fulfilling the definition of a medical device software as listed in the MDCG guidance, then we can speak about, I mean, then the softwares are supposed to be held or dealt according to the regulations, I mean, which are in place governing about the way on how the medical devices within the European Union are regulated. As you say, just to have a very quick understanding, I mean, just to develop an approach on how the softwares can be classified. So looking into 2 specific examples, I mean, you know, so the first one on the left, I mean, which is Tinker. So this is a Stay Bit or Be Well. I mean, this is a tracker that measures your heart rate, respiratory rate, blood oxygen saturation, and heart rate variability to determine your fitness and stress indices. So it is true that, I mean, the medical device, or this, I mean, the product in question here, the Tinke, is measuring your physiological parameters, as in the heart rate and the respiratory rate, blood oxygen saturation, and variability. However, at the end of the day, the dependencies, I mean, the usage of these particular parameters, they are not intended to be used within a particular, or within to provide an information for addressing a precise or a particular medical condition. Rather, it is directly talking about the determination of the fitness and the stress indices. That means classifying more onto the representations, like in a well-being software, or for the medical softwares, I mean, which does not have a precise medical condition. So, as we saw from one of the previous slides, that the applications which are targeting to, or which are having intended for the well-being and for the maintenance, or for the state activities purposes, so they are not very much included, or they are not very much classified according to the sorry, they are not very much concluded or within the scope of new medical device regulations. So this can be said that, okay, this is not a medical device, but I mean, this is normally a health app which can be used for tracking the fitness of the individual person. Whereas with the natural cycles, whereas with the other application, I mean, with the other example, which is depicted on the right. So this is used for tracking the fertility. And so what exactly happens here is, so the tracking, the user data is actually tracked through the software application, and how they normally track is every morning, I mean, the individuals are supposed to measure their body temperatures and they're supposed to give the software the body temperature that they measured by using the specific thermometer which is provided by the legal manufacturer. So in this particular case, so you are there, I mean, the user is giving the inputs, so it does actually classify, I mean, there is a the program which is in the mobile application. I mean, they do have, and they do some background checks based on the machine learning or intelligence algorithms, and they do predict on telling you on when exactly is your fertility dates and so on. However, I mean, here you're also trying to measure your vital physiological parameters, and you're making a decision which is clearly included within the scope of a medical device, I mean, which is talking about the control measures of the conceptions. I mean, any softwares or any devices which will be used in scope of conceptions or prevention and so on, I mean, they will be dealt as the medical devices. So hence, I mean, the second one, I mean, what we are actually having a look on will be considered or will be included within the scope of the medical device regulations, and the requirements of the medical device regulations needs to be fulfilled or needs to be applied according to the identified purposes or the general safety and performance regulations and so on. When we're mentioning about the different kind of applications, I mean, we also spoke about a software can be used. I mean, the definition of an accessory. A software can also be used as an accessory to a medical device. So in order to understand, I mean, when can a software be classified as an accessory? So an accessory is itself, I mean, any article or any device, I mean, which by itself is not a medical device, but rather it is only intended by manufacturer to be used in combination, I mean, with a specific medical device to achieve a particular medical purpose. So when you have a medical device, I mean, which includes the usage of an accessory, I mean, which includes the usage of a software, which is only enabling the particular medical device to reach its intended purpose or to specifically assist in to achieving the medical functionality, such products are typically kind of termed as the softwares or as accessories. And the softwares can also be classified as an accessory depending on the intended purpose, on how they are actually claimed by the legal manufacturers. So as we're speaking, the software can be an accessory, but when it comes to when a software is directly influencing, or if it is driving the performance of the medical device in question, then the classification, I mean, it is not very much relevant for the classification, because there are some new rules, I mean, which will say, I mean, which will now make the software be classified, or at least on its own right, and also asks to be included within the same risk class of the medical device when it is actually being driven, or when the software is actually driving or influencing the use of the particular medical device. As of now, when we are talking about the risk-based classification of the medical devices, so it is important to understand that within the scope of the medical device regulations, there are 3 possible levels for the classifications of the medical devices: the class 1, class 2, and class 3 products, which are talking about the low risk products, the moderate to high risk products, and the high risk products. Whereas the class 2 products are further classified into 2 groups, class 2A and class 2B, where class 2A is talking about the product classification, I mean, the risk classification from low to medium risk, and class 2B is further addressing from the medium to high risk. So very vastly speaking, in the classification framework of medical devices within the European, I mean, within the scope of the medical device regulations, you can separate your products into any of the classes as class 1, which are very low risk products, class 2A from low to medium risk or moderate risk, class 2B from moderate to high, and class 3 products, which are like very high risky products. And a couple of examples can be, I mean, as shown on the slides. I mean, for class 1, I mean, it can be for simple bandages or the wounds. For class 2A, can be syringes or for pump infusions. For class 2B machines or class 2B classifications can be anesthesia machines, whereas class 3 can be some implantable devices as in the stents or some other vascular or cardiovascular implantable devices. And to understand, I mean, how the classification is actually performed, so we do have a specific annex or annexure in the medical device regulations, which will guide us to understand, or which will guide us to classify the medical device that is being that is held in question, and to determine for which particular risk classification does the medical device belong to. So, as mentioned in previous presentation by Kim, the annex number 8 of the new medical device regulation, I mean, this will point out on the different rules for classifications. I mean, the different rules for allowing a particular medical device to be classified. And I mean, it is important to understand, I mean, that the software is also deemed as an active device, and the application of such classification rules need to be made on the intended purpose. So as we know, I mean, the intended purpose is the one, I mean, which will make a device to be in the scope of the medical devices or not. So it is also important that the classification of any particular device, I mean, which is sought to be governed by the medical device regulations, is supposed to be done based on its intended purpose. So all in all, in annex number 8 of the new medical device regulations, we do have like 22 different set of rules talking about the classifications, where the class 1 to rule 1 to 4 are talking about the non-invasive devices, and 5 to 8 about the invasive devices, 9 to 13 about active devices, and 14 to 22 about the special rules. So it is important for understanding purposes that when you try to make a classification of a medical device, you need to go through all applicable rules for your medical device purpose, I mean, for your medical device, taking into account the intended purpose, and then you need to classify your medical device accordingly. So that means if you have a software within active devices, I mean, you're not only supposed to look into the specific rules, I mean, which are talking about the active devices from rule number 9 to 13, rather you need to have an assessment of all other possible rules, I mean, which might be applicable for your device, and you need to have a justification on why so-and-so or a particular rule will be acceptable or will be applicable for your specific device. And in general sense, I mean, from the definition standpoint, a software shall be deemed to be an active medical device. However, the classifications on how, I mean, the software needs to be classified, or what can be the risk classification for a medical device software, will be addressed in detail in the classification rules described in the annex number 8, which we'll be having in our look. Before we look deeply on to the new classification rules, I mean, which were taken, which were brought into the MDR, let's try to understand the combination of accessories and the implementation rules for the software classifications, and for the accessories, I mean, which can also include softwares to be influenced, I mean, to be driving or influencing the device performances and usage. So if we're looking into the section 3.2 of the annex number 8, I mean, it is clearly said that the devices that are intended to be used in combination with other devices, so the classification of the devices, I mean, when they are used in combination with the other devices, I mean, they need to be done in a way that each and every device, I mean, separately. So if you have a specific intended purpose for each and every particular device, which are used in combination with each other, so the classification is to be done for individual devices, but rather than doing it for a system. So the individual devices which are supposed to be used based on their intended purpose, the classification of the devices will be done, and then of course they will be grouped together for being operated, and the criteria for the operations, I mean, will be covered within the phases of the VNV, but for the classification purposes, the intended purposes of the individual devices are supposed to be considered. And also at the same time, it's not just only the medical devices, but also the accessories which needs to be classified on their own right from the devices with which they are used. So if you say, I mean, we know from the definition of an accessory that an accessory is not a medical device by itself, but when you want to use an accessory within, I mean, since the accessory is enabling a medical device to reach its intended purpose, so the accessories are also deemed to be, or within the perspective of within the perspective of this regulation, the accessories shall also be classified according to their intended purpose based on their own right, separately from the device. And it's also important to understand that the softwares which are driving the influencing, I mean, which are driving or influencing the usage of a device shall fall within the same class as the device. So it is highly possible that sometimes, I mean, we might have only softwares which are responsible or which are used for getting some information from the device, which may drive actually the treatment, or which may help the physician or the healthcare practitioner to take some intermediate, or the immediate or the near-term actions and so on. But they might be not often very much controlled in the same way as in the main medical device. So, but now, in order to rework, the softwares, which are driving a device or influencing the usage of the device, so they are also supposed to be taken down into the same classification section. And the most important thing is that, the softwares will be or shall be now treated within the same risk classification as of the device. And also, if you say that the software is independent of any other device, that means if a software is capable enough to reach its own intended purpose, then the software needs to be classified on its own right. So if you say that the software is acting independently, it is not interacting with any other device, rather it is trying to reach its own intended purpose by its own, then the software needs to be classified in its own intended, in its own right, taking into account the intended purpose as specified by the legal manufacturer. And now, when we speak about the classification, as I mentioned, in the above slide, so the software, which drives or a device or influences the use of a device shall be falling it into the same criteria, or shall be falling it into the same class. So to understand, the software, when we want to say, the software is either driving or influencing the users of the device, it is important for us to understand that when a software is driving or influencing, it is either intended by the legal manufacturer to operate, modify, or control the device either via an interface or via the operator. So, for example, when you have a CT console or a remote control console for the robotic surgery, the software itself, so the way how you're trying to interact with the software is, so you have a hardware device, which is a console or the remote, and the interaction to the software is actually driven down, and this particular software, which is now within the medical device, is actually helping out to perform the robotic surgeries and so on. These are actually driving, the software which is inbuilt or which is integrated within the medical device is driving the clinical procedures and so on, and this is in a position to get in an interface with the operator or via another hardware or another software. And so, a software, it is important to get into the feeling on when actually your software is being understandable to have a driving or an influencing of the users of the device and so forth. So also, it is important to understand that when you say that a software is intended to drive or influence a medical device, so it is only necessary to include the softwares that are directly affecting the performance, the directly driving or influencing a medical device. So there can be a lot of softwares which may have an ability to influence, but they are not really intended. So it is always based on the intended purpose. So try to look from the perspective of the intended purpose. If the software is in a position to drive or influence the usage of the principal medical device in question, and in only case, when you can confirm that the software which is actually being used, which is in question, is influencing it or driving the usage of the medical device, then it is important for such sort of software to be falling within the scope of the regulation, but not in general. All the softwares which are normally used within a platform needs to be controlled according to the requirements of the new regulations. Also, same time, if we do have the several rules which are normally applicable for trying to classification of the medical device. So if there are several rules within which the same rule or within several different rules, as I was mentioning before, it is important for every legal manufacturer to walk through all of the classification rules and to determine which of the classification rule will be applicable. So it is not just only, if you only have a software, we are not only talking about to check for the applicability of rule number 11, which we'll be having a look in the next slides. But it is important for the legal manufacturer to go through all of the classification rules established within the Annex 8 of the MDR and to determine which of the classification rule will be much more appropriate. And in that particular case, I mean, if you have for a specific intended purpose, I mean, if you have for your specific product 2 or more, I mean, several rules that are being applied, then the classification rules are supposed to be, I mean, the risk classification of the device is to be taken into consideration based on the highest classification rule. So, for example, I mean, if you have applied, I mean, for one of your specific product, I mean, for one of the medical device, by applying a rule number 10, if you get into a conclusion that, okay, I mean, it can be a medical device of class 2A, rather when you are trying to consider or compare it from the perspective of the other rule, which might be also applicable as class 2B, then the strictest rule or the highest rule of the classification needs to be applied. So that means, I mean, your device then will no longer be taken into the risk classification of 2A, rather will be dealt according to the rule of 2B or the risk classification level of 2B according to the strictest rule that is also applicable for the intended purpose of your device. And now, when we are speaking about the specific rules for classification of software, Kim was mentioning in his previous presentation that under MDD, I mean, there is no specific classification criteria for software. Rather, in MDR, I mean, we do have a new rule which is talking explicitly about the classification of software, and this needs to be considered for the general sense in when a manufacturer is in a position to evaluate the software to be a medical device or not, and if it is to be a device, I mean, under what particular class the software will be belonging to. So in generic sense, I mean, the reason, I mean, one of the primemost reason for having a rule number 11 to be incorporated within the MDR is also due to the fact that in most of the cases, I mean, the medical device softwares, so they do not directly relate to the risks, rather they only relate to the consequences of the indirect harm or failure to provide the correct information. So if a software is failing to provide the correct information, so they, I mean, in the majority of the cases, the medical device softwares are taking part, I mean, they are related indirectly to the indirect harm or the failure. In order to address this gap, I think it's a rule number 11, I mean, which is also trying to address, or which is trying to talk about the situations as in where the information provided by the device, such as a medical device software, describing and categorization. I mean, you know, so the rule number 11 now takes into account the significance of the information that is supposed to be provided from the medical device software, and also it also takes into account the status or the combination of the status of the healthcare situation of the specific individual or the specific patient. So the classification of software will now be actually based, or will now be done based also on the conditions, as in the signification of the significance of the information that is being provided, and also taking into account the combination of the healthcare situation of the patient, so that the residual risk that a software being a part, or the software ending up as a contributing factor indirectly relating to the indirect harm or a failure of a particular individual is minimized. So the identification on the significance of importance or the significance of the information and on the healthcare situation. So these are taken down. I mean, these are inspired from the IMDRF or the GHTF IMDRF guidance document, where the software classification is based on the categorizations for the taking into consideration of the healthcare situations and for the information that is actually being provided, and then followed up with the second rule, I mean, where we are talking imprecisely about the monitoring softwares, I mean, which are trying to monitor the physiological processes, and talking about the immediate dangers to the patients. So if we go into the details of the rule number 11, we can say that for the wording, I mean, the software intended to provide information of which is used to take the decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes. So this is in generic way, I mean, the wording intended to provide information to take decisions with the diagnosis or therapeutic purposes. It describes in very general terms, I mean, the mode of action, which is basically the characteristic of the medical device software. So I mean, considering the genericity, I mean, this particular rule in generally will be applied for the majority of the softwares, excluding only those softwares that have no medical purpose, which can be classified into Annex 16 products. But if you have a medical device product, if you have a medical device software, I mean, which is intended to provide information or which is intended to take some decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes, so now, I mean, it is generally envisaged to be in class 2A. However, there are two exceptions when the intended, I mean, where the classification of the software can actually change, and this is taking into account the potential impact of the information provided on the significance of the information provided and the potential impact on the patient safety or the patient health status. So if you say that the software which is in question is actually providing the information which will be in a position, which will be used for making an immediate or a near-term action, or which can involve the death or an irreversible deterioration of person's state of health, then all such all such software shall be now classified as class 3. I mean, it's going to be a direct jump. Whereas if you say that the information, I mean, the significance of information is only leading to a serious deterioration of patient's state of health, or when it requires a surgical intervention to bring back the patient to his original state of health, then the software is classified as class 2B. So any software, I mean, which is intended to provide information for making the decisions with the diagnosis or therapeutic purposes, except, I mean, with the two exclusion or the exception criteria where the information that is provided by such software is creating a death or an irreversible deterioration, needs to be classified in class 3, or is a serious deterioration, needs to be classified as class 2B. And if the information provided is not resulting in a death or irreversible deterioration or a serious deterioration, can be then generally classified as class 2A medical devices. And now moving forward, I mean, there is also another criteria which says, I mean, the software intended for monitoring physiological processes and are classified as class 2A. Most oftenly, I mean, the software is monitoring physiological processes. They are intended, I mean, they are providing information which will be used to take decisions with diagnosis or therapeutic purposes. So, I mean, in this particular sense, I mean, it is indirectly related again to the statement, I mean, which is actually mentioned in the above sub-rule, when we say, okay, software is intended for therapeutic purposes classified as class 2A. And now, I mean, there is an exception here, which is talking about the software is intended for monitoring vital physiological parameters, where the nature of such parameters can have an immediate danger on the patient health conditions. And then in that particular case, I mean, they can be classified as class 2B. So this specific sentence, or this particular specific part, as in the intended for monitoring of vital physiological parameters, I mean, this is very much in line with rule number 10, I mean, the third section of the rule number 10. And in order to understand, I mean, why exactly, I mean, they are very much in line, I mean, let's have a very brief look on rule number 10. So the rule number 10 is basically talking about active devices intended for diagnosis and monitoring. Whereas, I mean, it also says that the active devices are intended for diagnosis and monitoring are classified as class 2A unless they are specifically intended for monitoring of vital physiological parameters. So sometimes it is possible that you might have a device which is which is falling under the classification of rule number 10, I mean, which is trying to monitor the physiological parameters, and the output of the output or the information output, I mean, is important for having an immediate impact or immediate danger for the patient health, whereas the softwares which are driving such devices, they can be actually neglected, or they can be left out with the current existing directives. So in order to make sure that the softwares are also considered and they're also falling on within the same classification levels of the devices, so we now have the second criteria of the rule number 11. So if you have a software which is intended to monitor, if you have a software which is talking about monitoring of the vital physiological parameters, where the effect of the non-conformance, where the impact can have actually an immediate danger for the patient, in such particular cases, all such softwares are supposed to be classified as class 2B. And then the last one is all of the other medical device softwares are in generally classified as class 1 softwares. So the softwares that exclusively drives or influences the usage, so everything can be now classified as class 1 softwares. However, it needs to be controlled. The software for the controlling or the supporting of conceptions, for example, the fertility apps. So we might have some special rules which are applicable for the softwares as well, which I was mentioning. It is important for analyzing all of the particularly applicable classification rules as listed out in Annex number 8 of the regulation, and to decide, what will be the classification criteria for the particular medical device software. So if you say that your particular medical software for contraceptions and so on, if you're only tracking up the abilities on the fertility applications and so on, software functionality can be taken down. The software is not performing any it's not performing, or it's not intended to take decisions from the diagnostic or the therapeutic purposes, so it can be taken down as a class 1 medical device. However, sometimes if it is truly used in sense of prevention or in the contraception, then you also have a separate rule for consideration, which can actually kick in, and the risk classification of such sort of a softwares are completely escalated to the next level. And now, so such softwares, which will be used in concept of contraceptions, will be classified as class 2B according to the new Rule 15 of the medical device regulations. And as I was mentioning, in the previous slide, that the significance of information, the classification, when we can say that the information that is actually being provided by the software will be having, or will be used, and how can we differentiate, or how can we understand on when the information is critical for the patient, or when there is no changes. So it is we can refer back to the MDCG guidance document. The MDCG guidance is basically based on the IMDRF guidelines, and the IMDRF guidelines is basically addressing about, is conceptualized or taking into account the information, the significance of information, where they try to divide the significance of information into 3 different categories. So the first one being, the highest, most critical aspect being, if the information that is provided by the software is used directly for treating or for the diagnosis, or if the information is only used in scope of driving the clinical management, or if the information is only for informing the clinical management. So when we speak about the treating or the diagnosis of the clinic, the information is used for the treating or for the diagnosis. So it needs to be understood that the output from the medical device softwares, the information that is actually being provided by the softwares, it is used for the treatment or for the diagnosis. So it is used for addressing an immediate health conditions of a particular or a near-time action for a particular individual. When we speak about the driving of the clinical management, so the information provided by the software will be used in aid of treatment, or in order to understand on how the diagnostic sessions are running, and if it will be it will enable the physician or the healthcare practitioner to make a decision on adapting the treatment interventions, or to change, or to act as a basic guidelines for defining the next diagnostic sessions. So that means it is not having a very much immediate or a near-term actions, but this will only enable to serve in a better clinically advisable way for addressing the needs of the individuals. And then, of course, the last one being the information for, I mean, just if the software is only intended to inform clinical management, so that means, I mean, there will be, it will not actually trigger any immediate or near-term actions. Rather, this is only for the informative purposes that the options for treating or the diagnosis and so on, I mean, they are properly informed for the clinical management, and they have a completely binding information. So, I mean, this is one specific way on how the significance of the information provided by the software is used for characterization of the criticality, and the other one being the critical, the healthcare situation or the condition of the patient himself. So the first of all, I mean, if it is a critical, I mean, it is important to understand. So the critical conditions or the critical situations, I mean, is the type of the disease or a condition, is it life-threatening, or can it involve the death of the person, or is it does it require the major therapeutic interventions? So taking into account, I mean, life-threatening, is this particular disease curable, and what about the clinical progressions and so on? So that would be classified as a criticality aspect. Whereas when we talk about a serious situation, not a critical situation, so we are trying to speak about to avoid any unnecessary interventions, or the timely interventions to maintain or to mitigate the long-term irreversible consequences. So that means if we do have I mean, if we do have a software, I mean, which is provide, I mean, if there is a particular healthcare situation of the patient where the where his health conditions made, I mean, where the decisions taken based on the information provided from the software is leading to an unnecessary intervention, as in the biopsy or other clinical intervention processes. So such sort of situations can be prevented. I mean, such sort of conditions can be prevented when there is an accurate diagnosis or the treatment, when the information received from the software as a medical device or from the software is helping the healthcare practitioners to prevent such unnecessary interventions, or to plan for a timely interventions to mitigate the long-term irreversible consequences. So the situations which are classifying, I mean, which are contributing for such sort of conditions can be classified again as a serious conditions, whereas for the non-serious situation or a condition is where I mean, the diagnosis and treatment is important. I mean, any situation, I mean, which can be taken down as the diagnosis and the treatment to be important, but it is not actually very critical for the interventions to mitigate a long or the irreversible consequences can be grouped together as the non-serious consequences. So depending on or clubbing the information from the significance of information provided by the software and taking into account the healthcare condition or the healthcare situation, so the risk classification of your medical device can be taken down or can be classified. And in majority of the situations, I mean, when you have the situation to be critical, and if software is actually providing you with the information to treat or for the diagnosis, it is often probable that you end up in the classification of class 3, the highest most risk classification for the device, and you need to ensure that the software will fulfill all of the regulatory requirements that are outlined within the scope of the medical device regulations. One slide and then the conclusion. I mean, with the increased requirements from the medical device regulations, and also, I mean, having now a specific rule for classification of medical device software, which is explicitly talking about the evaluation of the software involved within the medical devices as a standalone part or as an integrated part. I mean, what can be very much seen is, so the expectations, I mean, it is generalized, I mean, it is expected that there will be only very few softwares which will be classified as class 1 products, and there is a high risk that all medical or there is a high risk for medical device softwares or medical softwares being classified into the class 2B or class 3 based on the severity of the risks alone. So depending, I mean, as we said, I mean, the major application, I mean, the major reason for, I mean, the intended purpose is solely responsible for enabling you for the classification of a medical device. So the software providing information just only for a medical purpose is a medical device, excluding the software is used for transmission storage or for the simple searches, whereas the software driving or influencing the usage of your medical device can be is now classified also according to the own device rights and the own classification rules, which will be applied for the specific intended purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koushik. That was a very complete and very comprehensive presentation on how to classify and what qualifies as a medical device. I see that we have additional questions in the chapter, so we will definitely answer them after the presentation of Michael Lüttgen. We're going to give the microphone to him for his presentation on the funding opportunities and the support that can be provided through IT Healthcare Germany. Michael, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Kim. Yeah, just waiting for the authorization. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity here to introduce EIT. My name is Michael Lüttgen. I'm the liaison manager from EIT Health Germany, and I'm based in Mannheim, Heidelberg. And I will explain some aspects of the EIT Health community. And with respect to the time, I will hurry a little bit through the presentation, but don't worry, you can reach out to me afterwards and I will be available. And within the presentation, there are the links to the relevant information so that you will be able to get all this. Yeah, let's go ahead. Who is EIT? Probably a couple of you haven't heard about EIT Health before. EIT, the acronym means European Institute of Technology and specifically the branch Health. EIT is a public-private partnership which was established in 2015 as a knowledge and innovation community which we call KIC. This is part of the EIT as mentioned. And we are a non-profit organization. We are funded by the European Union. We are an independent body of the European Union, and our partners and other contributors are part of this partnership. Our funds go towards helping develop new and innovative products and services. And we educate companies, people, health innovation, and trying to support the innovative ground in Europe. Our goals is to strengthen healthcare systems in Europe, to promote better health of citizens, and contribute to a sustainable health economy in Europe. So this is the main umbrella. Our presence is European-wide. We have 6 regional innovation hubs, and Germany is one of them. We bundle some of the young members within the InnoStar to cover mostly the Eastern European territories, and we even have beyond Europe further hubs in the United States and Israel to connect EU activities into those regions. Our network has built an extensive European health innovation network. We are connecting, meanwhile, approximately 150 organizations and entities from business, research, education, healthcare delivery, and the cumulative R&D spends are more of 35 billion per year, meanwhile, and we have a thriving ecosystem of more than 750 startups, plus education and training programs. So after a couple of years, we evolved to a really meaningful, impactful organization. How do we support the participants and the society within our activities? We deliver access to knowledge and talents from world-leading organization institutions which are part of the network. We involve patients and market insights. Data access is an important part of the activities. Regulatory affairs support like today, product testing, validation, funding, education, market access, so a full bunch of measures within our network which should help to fulfill our main goals. And one example, as mentioned, is our market access seminar today, which is part of a market access seminar series in 2020. And here we want to enable participants to get insights and basic knowledge and specific knowledge as well, and access to deciders and players, actors within the health system, with doing such seminars like today, free of charge and open to everybody, but also doing matchmaking events with health insurance funds to start potential projects, to implement that into the field, and to get in contact with the right decision keepers in an early stage of their development. This is just one small puzzle out of our whole bucket, the market access seminar series. We are organized, as mentioned, as a public-private partnership. So we have some specific membership positions. We call them core partners, associate partner, and external partners. So this is really like a family or a club with contribution in several ways. But I want to skip this in the details because we are more focusing today on the external part of our networks, the startups, the entrepreneurs and innovators and learners, which are able to participate from our network without being a formal member, without paying membership fees. So this is also for the whole. Our programs are divided in three main pillars: the accelerator, the campus, and the innovation. The accelerator should shorten the time to market for entrepreneurs, startups, and small, medium entities. And so this is a business catalyst to grow and develop the business. The campus is more from the academic side, bridges the gap between academia and enterprises. We want to develop entrepreneurial skills and an early build-up of entrepreneurial thinking within the academic field, and to connect them with the industry and the players within the healthcare system. And the innovation part, which is mainly organized within the membership field, where we fund innovation projects with a big support of even financial supports, resources from the European Union, which is organized within the EIT society, but also in a certain way open to the external world. As the external partner, you can participate within these programs and contribute with certain restrictions. Who are the partners within this big partner network I mentioned? Looking at the core partners, you will see there are some leading main players from the industry as well from the academia, as well smaller companies and non-academic research institutions, so covering a broad portfolio here with extensive knowledge over the whole entire European Union. And the same picture from the associate partners. Here we have a similar mix, and you really find there leading organizations and innovative players within the healthcare, active members of our network, and which contribute to the project and enable access to their knowledge, to their expertise and their contribution. Mainly organized are the plans within a so-called business plan, a yearly business plan, with a defined cycle where we open our support and where you can apply within a certain way. And there's certain steps how to get involved in the process, how this will be evaluated. And this is a defined application process. There will be hearings, and at the end, if you got the okay for funding, the consortium will be set up and projects will be implemented. So this is mainly the case for the bigger innovation projects, but in general, there's always an application process and a hearing or confirmation. Looking at the last 4 years, about the contribution, about our funding structure, you see we have a pretty good evolution from starting around about 104 million euros. Now we are in 2019 about 441. So there's a significant increase of funding within the community. And what you here can see as well is that the contribution from the European Union as the EIT contribution is just a part. So the community contributes with own resources significantly, and this is part of this KIC EIT consortium concept that own contribution within the system is contributing to the entire program. Let us have a quick look on the accelerator pillar, because this is a part which is open for all entrepreneur startups, scale-ups, and small, medium entities in Europe, even without the formal membership. And here we have several programs. I don't want to go into detail, but you see the program is structured within several parts and 6 boot camps with validation labs, open IPA, MedTech boot camps, where we offer intensive up to 8-week programs to train early stage startups, to address key challenges regarding market access, marketing, and building up a company, and how to implement and how to realize projects, and which tools do I need to develop a company. So this is one part of the incubator. The second part of the accelerator is the validate, where we have living labs, mentoring, coaching network, where you can get access to expert support and mentoring from experts in the consortia. We have specific events like the Startup Meets Pharma event, where you get connected with Big Pharma and where you can evaluate your project and develop relationship with decision makers within the industry and to build up your expertise. We have different additional toolboxes like digital toolboxes, etc., etc. I'm just hurry about this with respect to the time, but you will find it in our catalog online, and I will support you with the links as well. The scale part of our accelerator is also an important and very valuable part of our system, specifically the Rochat program, which supports startups to scale up internationally. We want to connect you within the European, but even with overseas markets, so to enable young entrepreneurs to reach out to the bigger markets outside Europe and to connect within the whole global market network. One important aspect is also the access to finance within our investor network, crowdfunding platform, and the Gold Track program, where we deliver to specific projects high value of funding and a significant contribution to develop companies. As mentioned, you will find all these available programs on the internet on our website, and I would recommend to go to our EIT Health Accelerator catalog, where you will find all the recent programs which are still open or which are close to give you an impression what's maybe opened again next year within the next business cycle. There are different times of the year where certain programs starting. So the EIT Accelerator catalog gives you a clear overview of what is available. Is there something in for you which could be of value? And I can always connect you with a related accelerator pillar manager who is the expert in connecting you and helping you to find ways how to participate within the program. Access to finance is also a part of our, let's say, service. We enable you to participate in our investment platforms and the network, investor network, the crowdfunding platform, or the venture center of excellence. Here we have bundled significant players within the capital market and different systems how to get access. The application process is relatively simply. Try to find out if there's something of interest for you. Go to our websites and check the opportunity within those areas. Besides EITLs, for sure, there's a lot of other existing funding opportunities for market entry, and also for sure for basic research. There are European national regional programs available. There are numerous programs with different focuses. And I would recommend to order the newsletters of the following mentioned institutions to be always up to date, visit their websites, and inform yourself about current programs. This is quickly changing. There are constantly new business plans opened. Business plan cycles are sometimes periodic, but new programs are constantly being launched. So through the newsletters, you will be kept updated, and you will find the major information on the websites. Most of you will know certain institutions mentioned here, like Horizon 2020, where we are part of it. But there's something also regional schemes and national schemes which could be of interest. I put together some links of interest where you can get these newsletters, but where on the main page you will find information about funding opportunities from those organizations. So this was a very quick hurry in a nutshell, and don't hesitate to reach out to us and to be connected with our experts from the different programs. And yeah, so that's my part. Thank you for your attention. And yeah, let's open the discussion part. Giving back to the main moderator.
Thank you very much, Mikael, for the presentation. It's always impressive to see the number and the scale of resources and support possibilities that EIT Health is providing. So it's definitely open opportunities for manufacturers to seek support and for their ventures. So that's thank you for this presentation. We have now reached. Thank you. Yes. We have now reached the end of the event. We had the chance to go through different topics. Thank you for all the presenter for presenting their topic. I thank for the participant also to come and log and follow this presentation. I hope this was useful for you. And what we will do now is that we're going to address some of the questions if any questions are here. And to break the ice, I'm going to start with the question which have been actually posted in the chat. So feel free to ask any question, maybe by pushing them in the chatter, so that way we avoid to have everybody in the same time on the line. So the first question was from one person, was basically whether when we have a software medical device that is used sensor or camera from a mobile platform, if we require to verify the performance on every brand and model is running on. So the difficult answer here is yes. When you have a medical device and it's a software and it's running on different platforms, you need to ensure that the signal that you're capturing or the function of the hardware that you're activating are done in a safe and performing way. So you have to demonstrate, you have to find a way. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to test every model of every phone that is on the market, but you need to find a way to ensure that when you're running sensors or you're using function of the hardware, these functions are used in a performing and safe way. The second question, which was asked also on the channel, was basically if we would need a different CE mark or apply different regulation for the different mobile devices. If you have a software that is being deployed on multiple devices, normally you will have the CE mark for the software itself. Now, of course, the configuration may differ depending on the way you deploy it, but normally you have one product, which is your software. This is the one that you're going to see, Mark, and the scope of this software and the certification shall cover the different platform, the different mobile device that you're willing to use your software on. Last question that was on the chat was with regard to the, the slides that was presented by Koushik on the MDR, or let's say the guidance from the EMDRF. So that was a slide where you have different classification depending on the criticality of the software. And the question is whether it's applicable for MDR and IVDR as well. So the classification in that slide is specific to MDR. And the classification rules in the IVD regulation is different. We don't use the same scale. We usually use an ABCD scales, which is also 4-level, but it's not exactly the same. Nonetheless, the principle can be reapplied when it's applicable. So the rules are not exactly the rules for classification within IVDR are not only based on risk, they're also based on other considerations. So it's not a pure mimic between the two. So of course you can use this guidance to inspire you for the qualification, but you won't be able to use it directly for the IVDR per se. That was the question that were on the chapter. I hope I didn't miss anyone. I don't know if anyone is willing to take the microphone to ask further question. It doesn't seem we have much questions. So again, I thank the presenter for taking the time to present the different topic. I thank all the participants for registering with us, and I look forward to have you in a next online presentation. I wish you a very good day and see you maybe later.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to attend, and it was a great meeting, interesting information. Thank you.
Also from my side, thank you for being part of this session today, and I hope we will get the digital technologies in healthcare soon in a standard care.